quite attractive. The American tradition of non-interventionism in foreign policy also fed into this. The whole thing there was given a kind of radical twist by a change in people's attitudes in the 1960s and resistance to conscription into the Vietnam War. The result was in the end a somewhat odd mix of attitudes, because libertarianism on the one side may appeal to some people who are very, very conservative in their personal attitudes, and others who are very liberal in the sense of being in favour really just of people ordering their own lives as they'd like to, keen on private consumption of drugs and things of this sort. You'll get a whole mix. What, though, is characteristic is that people should make decisions for themselves rather than force those decisions upon other people. And so you may find the conservative libertarian and the kind of liberal libertarian disagree in terms of what personally they would like to do with their lives, but they agree that one person shouldn't force those things on someone else. Libertarianism, as a result, is a kind of loose movement which encompassed a variety of different people, divided between those who wish to get rid of the state completely and those who are somewhat uneasy about it but thought that it should be severely limited in its scope and what it did. Quite a sophisticated statement of this latter position is given in the Harvard philosopher Robert Nozick's book, Anarchy, State and Utopia. Well, while a good and non-fanatical exploration of what libertarian ideas mean in policy terms is offered in David Bose's book on libertarianism, he is a senior figure at the Cato Institute that I referred to before. So far, I've given you an account of libertarian ideas. But what have people said against them? Let's look at some lines of criticism. First of all, for some, for example, welfare liberals, the fact that the poor and the vulnerable aren't offered any guarantee of welfare when they may need it is seen as heartless or indeed as a denial of their rights. And so you get some welfare liberals just out and out opposed to libertarianism as being heartless or denying the rights, in their view, that some other people have. Indeed, they might follow up typically by saying that libertarians' arguments from rights, especially from property rights, are seen somehow as question-begging. How on earth, they might say, could people acquire rights of this hard kind, rights, to property in some absolute sense? Where do these sorts of rights come from? I mean, where do you dream them up from? If they're granted, all kinds of things follow, but where do you get them from in the first place? And some critics press that kind of objection. In addition, critics also raised doubts about markets and what they're being expected to do, and about a non-state legal system and what libertarians expect that to do. Will they actually deliver the goods? In addition, they might say, look, government may make mistakes, but is regulation always bad? Indeed, their critics may argue, and very typically do, that the state isn't half as bad as the libertarians have suggested. Why? Well, first of all, they say, surely there is democracy. Under a democracy, we may vote out our rulers from office. We may also submit them to various kinds of checks and balances, and to all kinds of forms of public accountability. I mean, we're no longer dealing with robber barons and people sweeping down on peaceable farmers from the hills. Second, they might say, isn't activity by the state in various forms needed? For example, might not, as the Keynesians argue, it be something which we need at times to get us out of certain economic problems? May there also not be other kinds of so-called market failures, cases where market relations just stuff things up? Say, for example, ecological problems. Isn't this an area where markets may not completely able us to handle the problems? Indeed, I'm going to turn to discuss this and arguments about it in more detail in some of the later lectures. In addition, one might say, don't Western democratic states also not offer some very important procedural strengths? I mean, there is a sense in which one looks to the state for impartiality. The state also is typically associated with the rule of law, that you know what the government is going to do and what it isn't, you can discover what the law is, and so on. There is also an important notion which one might refer to as public reason or deliberative democracy, the way in which, under a democracy, our ideas and our tastes are subject to a sort of critical check by other people. Indeed, these critics may say, what indeed of unchecked subjective tastes? I mean, if you're really going to have a system that responds to whatever our tastes are, what about discrimination? I mean, people may have racial discrimination of certain kinds. In a society like our own, they can't just act on the basis of it. It has to be submitted to certain kinds of checks. In a libertarian society, it seems as if whatever we want, we get. And more generally, one might say, what about a totally unchecked consumer society which really gives us anything that we want? Is that going to be good for us as individuals? Is that going to make for a good society? Indeed, some conservatives see libertarianism as libertine, as either positively favouring the idea that people should be able to indulge in any kind of conduct that they want, or, I guess a little more subtly, as serving to dismantle various kinds of institutions that currently keep us in check, and which in a sense stop us from behaving just as we want to, which keep us a bit under control. I need hardly say that these criticisms, if they're made, are contested, as indeed in turn are the responses. And if you want to get into good argument about politics, pick an argument with a libertarian. They'll typically argue your hind leg off. What altogether may one make of libertarianism? Well, first of all, I think everyone would have to agree that it poses an interesting challenge to usual ways of thinking about politics and society. Not least because it's really quite striking how it may bring together the highly conservative, for example, Christian homeschoolers who want to bring up their kids themselves, don't want to hand their kids over to government, the radicals who are deeply critical of tie-ins between government and big business, also kind of free market entrepreneurs, and also people who are genuinely libertine and just want to be able to do with other people whatever it is they'd like. I mean, all of these people might be lined up as libertarians, and the notion that you can get all of these people kind of in some ways in agreement about things is quite striking. It also offers what I guess you can term an interesting research program with striking suggestions about how the concerns of such a diversity of people could be accommodated. It is, in a sense, a vision as to how one might organize society, how one might meet a whole variety of needs. That's particularly pertinent and particularly interesting given the huge diversity of different views and so on that one gets perhaps within the US. Important elements of this, I think, are highly speculative. I mean, some of them are really a little bit wild. But on the other hand, it has in a way made a move from what was really the far political fringe to being a voice within US deliberations on public policy, for example, by way of the work of the Cato Institute, where quite often if you turn on a television now, you'll get a spokesperson from the Cato Institute commenting on things and offering suggestions. So in this sense, it's really become respectable, and it's come up with a whole bunch of interesting ideas. Let me now draw our concerns in this lecture to a conclusion. What have we done? Well, first of all, we looked at what libertarianism is all about. We looked at its connections with classical liberalism and how, in a sense, it takes broad classical liberal themes rather further than would many classical liberals. Second, we looked quite quickly, but I hope in a way that gave you some feel for what's involved, at how libertarians respond to what might seem obvious objections to their views, along the lines that there are surely some things that we have to have government there to do. We looked at libertarian responses to this and a little bit of the argument back and forth about them. We then looked briefly at where libertarianism came from, where it came from historically, and particularly how it developed in the US and how it took on board various different strands, as it were, from different points in the US history. We then concluded with some objections to libertarianism and, in a sense, on some reflections as to what we might make of it. And indeed, from here, looking at, in a way, the most extreme form of classical liberalism, we've set ourselves up, I think, quite nicely to turn in the next couple of lectures to look at some of the strongest opponents of liberalism in all its forms, namely conservatives.